Hello, everyone. This is another in our Talk With series, and it is truly my pleasure to be able to have Simeon Hein with us. He'll be talking about multiverse resonance in remote viewing, channeling, cold fusion, and contact. How's that for a combination of things? Now, Simeon has the website mountbaldy.com, which you might want to go to find out more about what he's doing. He received his PhD in sociology from the Washington State University in 1992. He's the director of the Institute for Resonance. He first learned remote viewing in 1996 and worked as an instructor at the Farsight Institute in Atlanta, Georgia. He has taught resonant viewing at the Institute since 1997. His main areas of interest include nonlinear research methods, complexity theory, technology and society, crop circles, and data concerning UFOs and ETs. Sim has done two previous talk withs, Macro PK Personal Experience That Changed My Life, and then implications of multiverse theories for ARV. So with that, Sim, let me turn the screen over to you. Okay, so you should have just gotten something on your screen that if you click, we'll all see your screen. There you go, multiverse resonance, we got it.
Okay, let's see. How's that? Can you see that?
Yep, looks good, full screen, nice.
I'll just turn my camera on for a second. How about that? Just say hi. Hey, everyone. How you doing today? We're coming to you from a undisclosed location, so it's great to have you all here today. And I will just turn this off to save bandwidth a little bit because I'm working from my modem here, my hotspot. So
okay.
Anyway, just to say hi there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So let's see. Okay. So thanks a lot, Marty. Thanks for having me here today again. It's always fun to talk to the APP group because you guys are kind of eclectic. We're always on the edge of discovering new things with ARV, anything related to RV. And it's really good to keep an open mind and have people that are actually doing experimental work, real work, something that actually can show results. I think that's really important. As Marty mentioned, I've been involved in these topics since I got involved with Courtney Brown in 1996. I am on his board of directors now, just as a fair disclosure there, is for the past couple of years. But it really introduced me to a lot of phenomena that I wouldn't have considered real until I experienced them myself. Myself and the other people in the class too. And I'm sure just like the rest of you here on the call, right? Maybe you have some natural ability. Maybe you just took an RV class, out of curiosity, but then something really blew your mind about it. You made target contact in a way that really defies any current scientific explanation. And you kind of got hooked into that. And that's kind of what happened to me. But that's not the end of what happened to me, because I ended up getting involved in many different topics because they all kind of sprung out of RV. And that's why I'm linking all these topics together. I saw Marty had a little email last night just kind of justifying why he put the word contact. Hey, I had changed it. Well, anyway. It is the topic that Marty told you a few seconds ago. He put the word contact at the end, resonance, channeling, cold fusion, RV, and contact. And I see all of these phenomena as being interrelated. And I know some of you and many people out there really feel like these are distinct subjects. They don't want their RV mixed with their UFOs, right? And the UFO people don't want their subjects mixed with ghosts. And the ghost people don't want their subjects mixed with Bigfoot, and so on, right? I have gotten this myself before, when I've posted videos that the cold fusion people liked over at ECAT World, which is a great site for keeping up with what's going on with LENR, cold fusion, that whole subject area, another resonance-based phenomena. And they said, we like your videos, but can you leave the RV and the crop circles out of it, and especially the UFO stuff? And so the answer is no. I will not separate these topics out, because you don't have to believe what I'm saying. This is just my point of view, obviously. I want you all to use your own minds and don't just believe it because I'm saying it or anyone else. But I'm convinced we're at the edge of resonant-based sciences, and they manifest themselves in different ways, right? But they're all based on the fundamental same sort of science, at least in part. Let's say that, okay? And so I told the cold fusion people, if you leave crop circles and RV out of a discussion of cold fusion, it's kind of like talking about Einsteinian general relativity theory, but leaving out a discussion of black holes, because it's too weird to think that there's such a thing as, a singularity that completely swallows itself. You can't. There were people that wanted to do that, 80 years ago or so. They didn't like what scientists like Chandrasekhar suggested Einstein's relativity theory implied, which is black holes, which turned out to be correct. Sir Arthur Eddington and others, they just were appalled by this. But it's the same thing now. We all have these kind of boundaries and boxes that we put things in. And I just want to give you a presentation today to encourage you to see why they may be connected from a theoretical point of view that I've been working with. And you can just make your own mind up if this helps you or not. So wait a second. Wait a second here, guys. This is oops. Let's see. This is not the right one because I was working on a new one. This is, yes, here we are. I don't know how to switch back there. This is what we want. Okay. That was one from 6 months ago, and we progressed from there. Okay, thank you. This is what we're talking about. So I've been reading a lot about Galileo, and the thing that's really interesting is that his time period, there was no difference between the word for world and universe. It meant the exact same thing, because people didn't think there was any universe beyond the world. So the ideas I'm going to present to you, if you think they're too much of a mind stretch, you can't imagine that things could be that big, just keep in mind that 500 years ago, people didn't think there was anything beyond the earth because it wouldn't serve any purpose for God to have anything beyond the earth, right? The planets out there were considered to be fixed on crystal spheres, and nothing changed. Nothing was thought to change beyond the moon, okay? So this was it, and no one could imagine that there were other galaxies and other solar systems or anything, because it wouldn't serve any purpose in their theology, right, from their religious orthodoxy. And people like Copernicus and Bruno and Galileo finally went up against this and really were smacked down pretty hard. Galileo, suffering house arrest after he was considered to not propose Copernicanism, but actually possibly believe in it. It was a lesser charge. It wasn't. This is, by the way, from David Wotton's book about Galileo. He's a great historian of science from the UK. He also wrote a great book, The History of Science, a book about the history of medicine called Bad Medicine, so forth. But anyway, the point is, people back then couldn't imagine that things could be that big. And not only was the words world and universe considered the same, but the idea of cosmography was just considered an exploration of the earth. There wasn't considered to be anything beyond what we can see right now. And that's how limited it was. And people were, executed for proposing the idea that it was bigger, that it was infinite, even that there were life on other planets. So we're always coming up against these limits of society and religious beliefs that always want to limit what we consider to be real. And those of us in the RV field also come across this all the time. Why? Because you've heard people say it again and again. I can see there's statistical evidence for this phenomena. Ray Hyman's response to Jessica Utz in the Congressional Review in '95. There's obviously a statistical pattern here, but there's no good explanation, so it's not real. That's the end of it. It violates my idea of what's real. Uh, I was reading something from Leslie Kean in Edge Science, which comes out of the SSE, Society for Scientific Exploration. I'm going to be publishing something with them in December. And I was just reading through some of the issues. And Leslie Kean, who's written about UFOs and is now writing about life after death, she went on to other topics, said that Sean Carroll, a well-known physicist, I think, from one of the Caltech universities, said, there's no such thing as telepathy or RV because it violates the 4 fundamental laws of science, and therefore we don't even need to consider it. Now, this is exactly the types of arguments that Galileo was up against, and Galileo turned out to be right, and the Inquisition, the Church, and the Aristotelians, who were also a big impediment to any scientific progress, the people that believed whatever Aristotle said was true. If it doesn't fit with what Aristotle said was true, it can't be real. That's what Sean Carroll is basically telling us, and a lot of other physicists. Look, it doesn't fit with the 4 laws. I don't even need to look at it. I don't need to look at the data. Don't bother me with the truth, right? You guys are all familiar with this. And so I just wanted to make you aware, people have been up against this forever, so we're not alone. We're in good company, right? And at the time, vacuums were not considered to be real. We're told that things like RV and maybe UFOs, telepathy, PK, something I talked about with you guys a year or 2 ago, something that I've seen examples of, I've seen it done in front of me. And I've been told by a former Secretary of Defense that they knew the Russians had successfully done this in 1976. They were observing this, and they know for a fact it's real. They never told us, but I'm allowed to tell you from them it's real. That's considered supernatural. Vacuums were considered supernatural in Galileo's time. It was considered weird and spooky because Aristotle said it's impossible. Nature abhors a vacuum. They're unnatural. It's supernatural. So there's always been things that have been considered supernatural, and scientists are always pushing up against this boundary. It's just a limitation of our social thinking. We could talk about that. It's a whole big subject, right? But that's what we come up against with RV. And no matter how much data we have sometimes, it's not considered enough. But I want to present something now which I think might explain some of this. If you let me know if this works for you or not. I talked about some of it in the previous talk, but we're going to go on today to show how it applies to different phenomena. It's the multi-world theory, the many worlds theory, the multiverse theory. Now, I don't really care which one of versions of these you believe in, but just to review, this was proposed by Hugh Everett in 1957 at Princeton when he was a graduate student, the many worlds theory. He didn't call it that at the time. It was just called relativistic states, but you can kind of get the idea. Everett didn't think that quantum mechanics as it stood from the Copenhagen people, Niels Bohr and others, Heisenberg, that it was a complete science because it couldn't explain so much about how it worked, and it depended on an observer. It was thought that if you didn't have a human observer and an experiment, you wouldn't get any sort of quantum effects. They didn't exist unless you observed them. And Everett just found that unsatisfactory. So he proposed that instead of having something like a quantum wave, a Schrodinger wave equation, an equation that explains how particles evolve over time at a microscopic level, that instead of having a wave which doesn't really become particles until it's measured or observed, that all the possible states exist, and that your consciousness is expanding to fill all of these possibilities at every nanosecond, okay? Now, I'm not saying that's exactly how it works, but this was where it was proposed in the 1950s, and at the time, this was considered so heretical that they wouldn't let him put it in the dissertation because they thought it would offend the orthodoxy of the time, not the Catholic Church anymore, the Copenhagen quantum physics people, Heisenberg, Bohr, and others. And they had this idea, it was this dualistic interpretation that we can get quantum measurements, but there's no quantum world, if that makes any sense. It doesn't explain any of the phenomena that you and I are interested in talking about here. It's just a way of measuring classical systems at a subatomic level. But that there's this quantum description, but it's not a reality in and of itself, and it doesn't exist until you're measuring it. That's what they believed at the time. Now, you have to understand that these great minds of the time, they were great physicists, but that doesn't mean that they were correct philosophically any more than you and I would be correct about working in another subject area. For example, I'm technically a sociologist. I'm not a physicist. I mean, I play one on YouTube, but I'm not technically a physicist. So it doesn't mean that my ideas have any weight here. But these guys were doing the same thing. They're physicists that are going into philosophy. They borrowed from German mysticism and Hindu Vedantism, Ayurvedic texts, and thought that that might kind of explain why things might be dualistic. Sometimes they're particles, sometimes they're waves. But there's no evidence for this. This was just their interpretation. And I have to agree with Everett, having looked over what he wrote and the commentary at the time. They were puzzled at the time by why do things seem solid if they're just waves, right? What Schrodinger called jellyfishication. How come everything doesn't seem spooky and weird and amorphous, ghost-like? Why don't we see the macroscopic state, not just the collapse state, as they called it? And they couldn't figure it out. And they created this idea that was later developed into what we call the Copenhagen tradition, which is that it's kind of this way, Schrodinger's cat. It's kind of the cat's both dead and alive at the same time. Particles have dual natures. And it didn't really resolve it. And for a lot of people, it's not considered satisfactory. It's considered an unrealistic model, that they look solid when you're interacting with them, but they're not really solid when you're not. In fact, they don't even exist when you're not looking at them. And a lot of people didn't find that satisfactory. And I have to agree with Everett that we kind of got snowballed by these guys, because since there was no really other competing ideas at the time, we kind of went with that because they were such brilliant people at physics. We kind of accepted their philosophy. But you have to remember, some of them were Nazis too. Just because they were good at physics doesn't mean that we'd adhere to their political ideas, does it? And that means we shouldn't necessarily accept the explanation either. In any case, it's important to remember that they didn't even invent the physics behind the quantum wave. If you look at the evolution of how, the atomic model, how it's evolved over time, you'll see on the far right the nodal mode model, which is what we use now, a wave-like pattern. But that was not invented by Schrodinger. It came from Ernst Florence Chladni, who was actually developing it in relation to acoustics, real acoustic waves. Chladni, who also, by the way, just as an interesting sub-fact here, discovered the reality of meteorites. He was the first to propose, with a couple others at the time, that meteorites really were from outer space. At the time, you're familiar with this, right? Meteorites were considered to be impossible because Aristotle said nothing's happening in the sky. There's no stones in the sky. You can't get meteorites because nothing happens out there. But he said, no, they're really falling from the sky. Eventually, it was obviously proved right. But at the time, meteorites were, at one point, in France, the Royal Society confiscated all the meteorites from museums and threw them away. And only one remained that was too big to cart away. And then what I've discovered is not only in France, but in other scientific societies started emulating the French scientific establishment, and throughout in Germany, England, they started throwing away their meteorites. But Chladni came along and said, no, these are really coming. They're not from volcanoes. They're not thunderstones coming from lightning hitting the ground. They're really from outer space. He was really proposing an extraterrestrial hypothesis. People didn't believe it until enough meteorites fell and there were witnesses and so forth. But he's also known as the father of acoustics. And he created the idea of nodal modes, the idea of how sound moves. And you've all seen examples of cymatics, Hans Jenny, and on YouTube, those pictures of the sand grains moving around. That's what Chladni discovered. And the mathematicians at the time, Euler and Lagrange, let's go back to that. Euler and Lagrange, Laplace, worked out all the mathematics. So Schrodinger didn't even have to invent any of the mathematics for this mystical quantum wave. It was already there from all these guys, at least for one electron systems. It gets a little more complicated when you have a couple electrons. But the ideas in the math for quantum mechanics all came from the science of acoustics. And so when we think about quantum mechanics, it almost seems like something that's untouchable until you realize that they just used whatever math was around, and it came from real physical waves of sound. Okay, things that you could feel physically, not something that's imaginary that uses imaginary numbers, because modern quantum mechanics will tell you it's not really a wave. It's a mathematical probability distribution, but it's not a physical wave. But no, originally it was really a wave. And why would atoms, subatomic particles, behave like sound waves? Exactly. The math translates perfectly if there wasn't some physical reality to it. Okay. So these are some of the things that Chladni, Chladni plates, as they're called, right? This was the beginning of cymatics, which, I used to show this in my remote viewing classes in Boulder, videos of cymatics and the people that worked with this. And it's amazing that sound creates these coherent shapes when you put sand on a metal plate and then you apply a violin bow to the edge, or you can now, obviously electronically, because we have that now, it didn't exist at Chladni's time, transmit sound into the metal plate. You'll get these coherent shapes, which are the origin of the quantum wave. I just think that's really interesting. So you'll see it's not totally sacrosanct. You can criticize quantum mechanics, and it's fine to do it because it came from somewhere. Now, others like Alexander Lauterwasser, developed more complex versions of these nodal modes, but it looks a lot like the models we have of atomic particles, doesn't it? Because it's all the same thing, right? Okay. Even Faraday used field lines, right? The lines of force with electromagnetism from Chladni. So basically, physics was based initially on the physics of acoustics. That became the math, and it became the basis for Lagrangian mathematics, which is kind of shapes how our physical world works. It's just interesting to just realize this. But at the time, about 50 years ago, when Everett proposed this idea, there was this idea that the wave has to collapse to become matter. It doesn't exist on its own. It's a wave, and then you measure it. And von Neumann suggested that that the Schrodinger wave equation describes how things evolve at a subatomic level. But then the viewer comes in, and there's a cut, right? And it collapses, and that's what we see as the world around us, the apparent solidity. But Everett didn't find that satisfactory, so he suggested there is no cut and there is no collapse. No one's ever seen a quantum wave collapse. And what Everett even went further and said, well, how come we can observe anything at all if we're in a superposition, if we're made of subatomic particles? Why do we have a privileged position versus a tree, blade of grass, a rock? You kind of get the idea. What is it? And, obviously lots of debates about what consciousness is and so forth. But the point is, it didn't really seem to make sense. It was just kind of thrown in there because these guys were doing the best they could. The math worked out, but they couldn't explain it. So they came up with that there's a collapse when you're observing it. Otherwise, it's a waveform. And when you're not paying attention to it, it's in its own kind of quantum space. Now, von Neumann suggested another idea that Everett took off on, which is where multiverses came from, in my view. Which is psychophysical parallelism. And this kind of applies to us as remote viewers because he suggested that subjective processes are as real as objective processes. Now that's quite a leap. It's almost like a Galilean leap, right? Because in our world, right, the way you and I have grown up with our education system, we're taught that the objective world is somehow different from the subjective world. And this is what got a lot of scientists in trouble with the Catholic Church a long time ago, too. They didn't like this either. But what von Neumann suggested is that at least mathematically, states in your imagination, subjective states, subjective perception is as real as any objective state you can measure. In some sense, they're equivalent. And so Everett was able to take that and say, okay, we have this wave equation, right? But I don't buy the idea that anything is collapsing, which some people call the disappearing worlds theory, because when you do a quantum experiment, all the other possible states are thought to just cease to exist. But where do they go? Okay, and aren't you part of the? Let's say someone's observing you. Are you collapsed into a state? It's sort of, that's called the problem of infinite regression. Who's observing whom, right? If the scientist is being observed, I've asked the question to Dean Radin and others at times at conferences. Well, if remote viewers are viewing a scientific experiment, either back in the past or the future, are they affecting the quantum wave of that experiment? Are they affecting the dynamics of that? I mean, we know that Pear Labs was able to do it in real time, but let's say you and I, we get together with Marty and we do a future viewing on some very sensitive experiment. Are we going to affect it from the past? Because according to this, we should be able to, in actually a big way. But the other way to look at it is nothing's collapsing at all, that all these possibilities don't cease to exist. They're all real, but your consciousness is somehow moving between them, and you're perceiving one possibility or another, but they're all equally real. And that's sort of what von Neumann, in a sense, is suggesting. At least that's the way Everett interpreted it. I think it's a realistic way to look at it, that in a very fractal way, at the microscopic level of subatomic particles, or the largest possible level of the universe or the multiverse, that it's all being governed by some sort of evolution of a wave equation, and your awareness is shifting through these different worlds. The only thing about the many worlds interpretation is, for Everett to be able to make the math work, these worlds can never interact. Okay, so even though there's these, this by the idea, by the way, this idea did become more popular once we got to the 1970s. I mean, there was people named the DeWitts, Bryce and his wife, who found Everett's dissertation and thought, wow, this is actually really good. And by that time, we had Star Trek, right? And it was considered sort of acceptable. And in 1978, there was actually a conference in Austin, Texas, the university, about multiple worlds, right? And Everett was briefly allowed to present on it. It was the only time he actually there was a conference in Chicago too, but I mean, for the most part, he was a pariah to physics because of this, and he quit. He went to work for the Defense Department in the planning the Strategic Integrated Operating Plan, which you all know what that was. It's how to calculate kill rates from nuclear weapons in the maximum way. That's where he ended up, because his brain sort of liked that. He went out of physics, but the idea remained, and people took it and developed it in different ways. And by the 70s, it was considered acceptable. But the thing about Everett's point of view that matters for us is these worlds never interact. You don't get interactions between different dimensions, between different parallel states. Everett creates the idea of parallel realities, but you'll never know they exist. And it doesn't help us with RV or any of these phenomena. Okay? We can talk about that again. But Everett wanted it to stand quantum. He was like he believed in quantum mechanics, but didn't think it should need an observer, right? Or anything else outside of itself. The wave equation should be enough to explain everything. Okay, so you kind of get the idea about this. But there's no interaction, so there's nothing really going on to explain why you could get, advanced perception, telepathy, precognition, any of the cool stuff that we've all seen evidence for. It doesn't provide any support for that, in my view. Okay. So this is the splitting process that came out of Everett. Now, when Everett went over to finally present this to Niels Bohr, they would not even talk to him seriously. They thought it was a joke. And he came back, he did get some good ideas over there over a couple beers in the bars in Copenhagen that helped him develop these ideas, but they wouldn't talk to him. So, you can see this, guys, this orthodoxy, it pervades religion, it pervades science, it's everywhere. This is our challenge, in my view. Well, those of us alive now, is can we get beyond this narrow view that we're right and everyone else is wrong? Because even the quantum physicists, they would not have anything to do with the multi-world theory. So there's a newer idea, and I talked about this in the previous talk to you last year, the many interacting worlds view. Now, this is what I want to talk about and how it applies to some of our phenomena for the rest of the talk, okay? The many interacting worlds view starts with the idea that there is a near infinite number of parallel realities, but it differs from Everett's view. These are not splitting off and being created every nanosecond from every observation or interaction we have. They just pre-exist from the beginning of time. You just accept that you have to accept this for this to work, that there are parallel realities and they interact, okay, slightly. Marty sent me an article from one of your speakers. I forgot her name, Marty, but she had some of the objections to the Everett point of view, which is like what constitutes an observation and so forth. And those are all good criticisms of the Everett view. I mean, it's not that it seems, you can't reject Everett because as I've heard people say, I don't like the idea of a million me's, because that's what Everett's suggesting, that you're in millions and billions of parallel realities, versions of you that we would say were you. They're similar enough. And people often object to it from the point of view. I've heard people say this even at SSE. I don't like the idea of a million me's. I just can't imagine. You'll see this on YouTube on some of the PBS series. To me, it's not a valid criticism. Just go back to Galileo again. At the time, people could not imagine that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. They could see the sun going around, and that was enough for them, right? Well, that's not a good enough reason to believe that we're the center of the universe, and it's not a good enough reason to reject many worlds theory, multiverse theory, parallel realities, just because you don't like it. I mean, my conscious mind did not like RV when I started doing it either. Honestly, I couldn't see how I had perfectly described some of these targets. I was a bit uncomfortable with it. I could see it worked, but I couldn't see how I got there. And that's not a good enough reason to reject it. And it's not a good enough reason to reject Everett. But you can look at other models of the multiverse to see how they explain the phenomena that you and I deal with and see which explains better. Now, the many interacting worlds idea is basically that you don't even need the quantum wave. This is sort of one step beyond quantum mechanics. It's basically saying that all the phenomena that you and I identify as being associated with quantum mechanics, very powerful phenomena that allow us to have this teleconference right now because it's embedded in all of our electronics. It's got to work or our electronics wouldn't work. That's actually being created by the interaction of multiverses. Very, very subtle interactions, but when you've got a near infinite number of parallel realities, it could be as subtle as you want. You've got enough to make up for the subtleness. Even New Scientist had an article about this, is that we're surrounded, New Scientist called it ghost universes. You don't need a quantum wave if you have parallel realities because the subtle interaction between the parallel realities literally creates all the effects that we call quantum effects, quantum tunneling, double slit experiment, a whole nother range of quantum phenomena. And the simulations actually work out. You get the same effect as if there was a quantum wave there without the quantum wave. You don't need it. When you model the interactions between parallel realities according to this view, and this comes out of pure Lagrangian physics, going way back to Chladni and all this. If you just take Lagrangian dynamics, which are basically, for those of you that are not familiar with it, it's basically the law of least action. That if you pour water, it's going to fall to the lowest point, right? You've never seen a river kind of jump out of its riverbed and then back down. It just stays there and goes to the lowest point. That's Lagrangian dynamics. It works with gravity. It works with energy. Basically, everything's kind of going to the state of least effort. And this kind of simplifies Newtonian dynamics for us. It's how our world works, our physical world works. The interesting thing is, if you take an infinite number of these worlds and you say that they interact a little bit, you end up with the exact same quantum effects without any quantum wave. And because no one's seen a quantum wave, this doesn't actually disprove that there's a quantum wave. But it sets itself on an equal level because it's saying we can actually create the same effects with modeling. And quantum modeling, by the way, is not some lightweight thing. This is very done extremely precisely now with like ultra cold materials, Bose-Einstein condensates, this stuff. People win Nobel Prizes for this, simulating creating quantum phenomena with ultra cold atoms and so forth. So quantum simulation is a very highly developed field, okay? And the models that work with the many interacting worlds model show that you get the exact same effects, with even just modeling with a couple parallel realities because the math, there's so much of it. But even if you take one parallel reality, as you increase the number that you're simulating, you get closer and closer to what quantum mechanics would predict, which means you can't say anymore that it could only be the quantum wave. It could be coming from this. It doesn't prove that this is correct, but I think you can see what I'm saying. It's kind of on equal standing with the Copenhagen tradition now because the math works out just as well. So what I personally like about this model is not that it replaces quantum mechanics or anything like that. We still have the same effects. It just says there's interaction between parallel realities a little bit. And so maybe the quantum wave was kind of like epicycles, these motions that the planets would apparently make in the sky before people understood about planetary orbits around the sun, and the differential rates of rotation would create the feeling, the appearance that the one of the planets would be moving backwards for a few weeks and then forwards and so forth. That was epicycles. And they never existed, but it worked for a while. Or phlogistons, this was the theory of what created heat. There were, at the time, before people understood about molecular dynamics, there was thought to be like a heat particle or something like this, which doesn't exist according to what we know. So perhaps the quantum wave is kind of like that. It sort of seemed to do something, but it's a black box. When you ask quantum physicists how it works, they say it doesn't matter. The math works, so just focus on the math. Basically, it's called shut up and calculate. But what I like about MIW is it takes another idea from Bohm and de Broglie, the de Broglie-Bohmian pilot wave idea, but says it's a multidimensional pilot wave. And when you add that to Everett's many worlds, you end up with MIW. So you have this kind of realistic interpretation of physics that starts out with sound, right? The physics of sound. It works with Lagrangian dynamics, which is the basis of all the physical stuff that we do, from getting rockets to the moon to how satellites orbit and so many other phenomena that involve physical matter. It works seamlessly with that. But you have to give up one odd idea, which is the mystical quantum wave, and kind of accept another odd idea, right? The other odd idea is that we're surrounded by a near infinite number of parallel realities. I mean, they're right in the same space that we're in right now, but they're at a different frequency. And some of them do interact with us, and you get bleed through, okay? So basically, MIW says quantum mechanics exists, but it's an effect. It's not a cause of anything. It's effect of multiverses. And so the way they talk about it in this model, it's that parallel realities in similar configuration spaces create these very subtle repulsive pressures that interact on a subatomic level with our own matter. Another way to think about that more simply is that parallel realities that are kind of at a similar resonance interact with our reality. It's been calculated to be 41 electrons, 41 parallel realities per electron. That's how specific this theory gets so far. So you only need 41 parallel realities to explain quantum mechanics. But obviously, 41 interacting per subatomic particle. You don't need any more than that. It's not like all the parallel realities are interacting all the time. But if you get enough at the same resonance, that's my interpretation of it. They would say same configuration space. They begin to interact at a subatomic level. And the way I kind of think about it, it's almost a little bit like raindrops kind of falling down on a window. Sometimes they stay separate, all the raindrops, but sometimes they coalesce, they hit into each other, and you kind of get a dynamic interaction going, right? And it's a self-sustaining trajectory. That's what we get with the MIW model, these kind of self-sustaining trajectories. And I would argue that that is what we're seeing with some of the phenomena that we're experiencing, whether it's RV or any of the other topics that we're mentioning here. You can see that the double slit experiment is reproduced even just with one parallel reality. It's extremely close to what you actually get. The more parallel realities you add in, the closer you get to what double slit shows. So that's kind of really interesting if you think about it. I mean, if you take out the quantum wave, you still get the same data. So maybe you never needed it. And even the creators of MIW theory have said publicly that they're physicists, okay? They don't deal with the spooky stuff that you and I deal with every day as part of our lives, studying remote viewing, and for me, it's crop circles and cold fusion, all that other good stuff, whatever you like. But they're basically saying that interactions with other worlds is no longer a fantasy, right? That's what they're saying. A couple of them have said this. I mean, they're not dealing with this. They're just modeling the math here, but they're saying we're interacting with other worlds. It's a type of bleed through. Now, when I look at all the data that I've seen in the last 20 years, ever since I met Dr. Courtney Brown, started studying remote viewing, it all seems to me like a type of bleed through in one way or another. And this MIW model is very similar to that. I'm not saying it's correct, but it's just interesting that it fits what you and I experience with our work in this area. In the case of RV, what you're getting with the bleed through is there, a couple types. It could be you're contacting a version of yourself that's in a parallel reality, experiencing that target in real time, or that there's versions of the future that are happening now. They're so close to what our futures will be like that you resonate with them and you pick up the target that you're not going to be shown for a week, like with ARV. So the bleed through would be coming from the present, which we call in our language the future, but it's already happening now. And you're resonating with one or two of those targets. Oh, you know, usually the idea you want to resonate with the one you're going to be shown, your feedback the following week or the following hour or something like that. But basically it creates this idea. This is their words, not mine. Interworld potential. Interworld potential between parallel realities. So if you just stop for a second and think, you and I live in a universe now. We live in a world where this has now become accepted science. This is from peer-reviewed journals. I'm not saying everyone agrees with it. When I look online, see what other, more traditional physicists say about this, sometimes it's the most caustic, scurrilous attacks on this point of view, which leads me to believe it's correct, because that's what they did with Galileo and Copernicus. And if they're really attacking it, it must be something good going on there. So they are now saying that there is an interworld potential from this model, which stands at least mathematically equal to Copenhagen and Schrodinger quantum wave. Okay, the same explanatory power. This also suggests, as I mentioned in one of the previous talks, super non-locality. The idea that our world could interact with another world at another level, and that world could actually interact back at a distant point in our world again. So we're actually interacting with that distant point on our own planet through a third reality. It's built into the model. Okay, I'm not dragging this in. Now, they don't use the word PK, micro PK, but I know PK is a fact. Without a doubt, I've seen it, and I've had people that worked in the national security apparatus tell me they know the Russians were doing this in '76. They heard it live. They saw it. Okay, they didn't see it. They were able to monitor it. So, what does explain this? We're not going to go the Sean Carroll route, saying it violates the. See, here's what's wrong with Sean Carroll. Okay, maybe in our reality there are the four fundamental laws of physics, but what happens when those four fundamental laws of physics interact with the other parallel realities with the same laws? You end up with this. You can just keep four and you still end up through Lagrangian dynamics with all of the spooky effects that you and I have all come to love and know over the course of our careers in these kind of weird areas. Now, hopefully, what this is suggesting to you is that all the stuff you and I have been studying, for me 20 years, maybe for some of you longer, some shorter, this is not weird anymore. All of a sudden it becomes normal. If you accept the idea that they're parallel realities, okay, what would that be like? Imagine you're tuning your radio tuner, and you have different stations on the same FM or AM band. You don't hear one of the other stations. You only hear the one you're tuned to, unless you get the bleed through, right? Like on AM, you're going to get a little bleed through from a neighboring AM station that could be coming from another country or something. I used to listen to shortwave radio a lot. I learned how radios work. There's frequency modulation, which has this capture effect. FM was designed so that you didn't get the bleed through like you got with AM. But we already have that kind of analogy, right? At least you can agree with that from the idea of radios. That's the same idea with parallel realities. There's slightly different frequencies. They're similar enough to create bleed through with ours, but they're kind of their own distinct reality in and of themselves also, just like radio stations. And so the implication of this is that even in our own world, there are things that we're not seeing that are there, that when they bump into another parallel reality, we see them here, but they're not coming from another parallel reality, right? They're already in our reality. We're just not seeing them until they have that interaction. That's what it suggests. I'm just following the logic of this. So things that seem strange may not be coming from another parallel reality. I mean, I can't rule that out. It's suggesting that there's interaction of energy with those other parallel realities where we can process the information where it manifests as something that looks solid or even might be physically solid here, but the energy pathway, the Lagrangian energy pathway, is not coming directly just from our world. It's coming from another world also. That's what this says. Now, another way to look at this, and don't flip out on me by suggesting this, because I don't want this to seem scary. But what it suggests is that the multiverse, even though the interactions are ultra weak, it's highly precise. Otherwise, you wouldn't get these quantum effects. And it's a kind of an overarching superstructure that you and I are part of. Okay. And it kind of suggests you can't get out of it either. In other words, we're surrounded by all these parallel realities. And if you're not in this one, you're going to show up in another one. And if you kind of see the imagery that I'm creating, you're surrounded by lots and lots of energy information that's only some of the time slightly interacting with you, but there's tons of it all around. So when you look out and you see empty space or something like this, that's nothing. That's not where it's happening. It's filled with other stuff going on, but it's at different frequencies, okay? That's just one implication of it. I mean, I'm just playing around with this, for the past 2 years or so. Seems to me what it suggests is that we're surrounded by life, but we can't see it. Okay. Now, here's some of the applications that I think I want to show you in our remaining time. Some of the applications of this and some evidence that this is maybe how it works. Because what's the biggest criticism that folks have of our stuff? If it's, first they'll say, okay, you have the data but no explanation. Then they'll say there's no data. You can't prove it. The multiverse, this multiverse example is just philosophy. Well, I think there's some evidence here. Let's look at it. Richard Wiseman, okay, he wrote this book, The As If Principle, which I actually like because he basically suggests, he's the psychologist, right? You guys know Richard Wiseman. He's a super critic of RV. He said he's reproduced a lot of the Gonsfeld experiments, things like that. Some of the Dean Radin's presentience experiments, and that he didn't get the same results. I asked Russell Targ once why. I said, "Why come Dick Wiseman always gets different results?" And Russell said, "He just doesn't want to. He just doesn't want to get the results. It's his effect of his intent there." Well, maybe that's what it is. I liked his book though, The As If Principle, because he basically suggested it's a type of psychology that came from William James, the psychologist from the 1800s at Harvard, and he created a different point of view to Freudian dynamics and the unconscious and all this. He just said that if you want to make something real in your life, you just have to act like it's real, and the very physical act of pretending and acting like something's real changes your demeanor, your emotions, and your feelings. You actually feel different, and it became this type of psychological methodology that was employed by psychologists. There was this guy, George Kelly, who used this about 100 years ago. And what he noticed is that a lot of his clients, when they started acting differently, acting as if something were real in their life, right? They began to feel like they'd always been that person, the other person that they'd become. And when I read that, I said, that's a little bit like what MIW is suggesting, that there are these alternative possibilities. But when you shift to another possibility, it's always been there because it was its own distinct reality the whole time. Okay, there's one little piece of evidence there. Then we have evidence from people that have had what's now called dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called multiple personality syndrome, right? Multiple personality disorder. Well, the thing is it a disorder at all? Because from the MIW point of view, my interpretation of MIW, that people that do have these multiple personalities, they're actually all real personalities. It's not like this person is really just Christine Kost. Remember, this is from that movie, The Three Faces of Eve. It was a book. It became a movie. A lot of people said that these two psychologists, Thigpen and another one, that they exploited her and so forth. There's a lot of controversy around it. But she was a real character. The interesting thing about it is that some of her personalities had allergies. Like one was allergic to nylon, and the other Eve, Black Eve, the bad Eve, the one that was a bad girl Eve, liked to wear nylon stockings, which in the 50s would be, kind of very naughty. But the other versions of her were allergic to the nylon. So how do you explain that from any conventional physical point of view, that you could have, and this has been seen a lot with people with multiple personalities, that one personality will have diseases, and then when they shift back to the other personality, the disease vanishes, like something like diabetes. I mean, how could it just go away according to our current medical model? It's very hard to explain. There was this movie about it. Remember earlier this year, Split? one of the characters had some diseases, the others didn't. But that's actually based on real fact. And then there's things like channeling. I've been following this channel, Bashar from Daryl Anka, for a while. Now, I came across Daryl because he channels this entity named Bashar, who allegedly is an extraterrestrial from the future, who he says will actually meet him at some point, maybe in about 10 or 15 years. But you don't have to believe that. What the interesting thing about Daryl was he talked about Courtney's book, Cosmic Voyage, the book that I read that got me involved in RV. Bashar talked about the book coming out before it had even been published. He said there was a book coming out about RV, Cosmic Voyage. It hadn't been published yet, and he said it was 98% accurate. And that got people to come from LA to Courtney's class. And I thought, well, who is this Bashar person? I came to a conference at Estes Park, Star Visions Conference 96. I heard Daryl talk, and this is what he sounds like. Can you hear that? Or
No. Mm-mm.
Okay, sorry. So you can't hear my audio on that. Let me wait. Hold on a second. One sec. So you could hear that a little bit, right?
I heard a strange, almost staticky sound. I didn't hear a voice.
Oh, it's doing noise canceling. That's sorry. Okay, I can't play the sound. I don't know how to play the sound. Maybe we'll figure it out by the end of the call. Right. But when Daryl is channeling, it's a totally different personality. Okay, you can go just Google Bashar. You'll hear it. It's a totally different person. When I first heard this, I thought, this guy is an actor. He's making this up, right? I mean, he's a good actor, and the voice is changing, and it's very high pitched. But after about half an hour of listening to this guy in Daryl channeling in 1996 in Estes Park, I thought no one can keep talking like that for half an hour, just with intelligently. And by an hour and 15 minutes, I was convinced that this really was real. A chance that something different was coming from this person. I actually came back the next day for the workshop. I got so interested, so I switched over. So how would you explain something like that from the conventional scientific model? Apart from all the typical, debunking and so forth, let's say, accept that it's real, something else is coming to the person, like multiple personalities, whatever you want to believe it is. How would you explain that? Daryl's brain has been measured. He came out he made a documentary. It's called First Contact, by the way, about how he got involved with this and the implications. He says that channeling is something that we all do when we're being creative, playing music, or involved in something we really like, that's a very mild version of the channeling effect. And what he's doing is just something that's more extreme. But when his brain waves are measured, they're actually at 40,000 hertz. For you and me at a resting state, I forget what the beta state is, but it's around 8,000 to 10,000, right? So there's physiological changes here, just like someone with personality shift. And again, from a many interacting worlds model, you would say, well, what is he, Daryl or Bashar? He's both. It just depends what frequency you're at the time, but both are real parallel streams that somehow interact and allow the personality to really shift more than you would think. Okay. So then you get to psychic surgery. Now, again, something I would have been skeptical of before I found evidence of it, but there was this guy, Masao Maki, who came out. We met him in the crop circle country in the UK. I've been involved in doing crop circle tours there. We'll still do them because my interest in it is so many weird electronic and electromagnetic effects around crop circles, even the ones we make. Very hard to explain and very interesting. But Masao was there, and here we are making a circle together. He had written this book, In Search of Brazil's Quantum Surgeon. He went to Brazil attempting to debunk the so-called Dr. Fritz entity. He just thought, he considered himself a debunker, by the way, until he took my RV class. He went, met quantum surgeon Dr. Fritz. He went down there, and he showed us pictures of Dr. Fritz operating on people with chainsaws and drills, power drills. Blood is going everywhere. I mean, you can see See one of the women there, Rosemary, her hand is over her face. I mean, this is after dinner, people are getting nauseous. The people don't experience any pain and they feel cured and healed. And Massa went down there and saw that it was real. He concluded, that's why I wrote the book, it's a real phenomenon. Now, the interesting thing about Dr. Fritz, he's channeled through different people over the decades, all in Brazil. This is the most current person he's coming through, Rubens de Farias, who's a computer programmer. Now, you can see Rubens wears these thick, round-rimmed glasses. When he's channeling Dr. Fritz, his eyesight's perfect. How do you explain that? I mean, if you said he's pretending to be Dr. Fritz, how could he not need his glasses? All of a sudden, perfect vision, operates on hundreds of people a day. And people, no one ever says they feel any pain. We're talking about spinal surgery, brain surgery with no anesthetics, no hygiene, anything. His brainwave is also been measured at 40,000 hertz, just like Daryl when he's channeling. So I'm suggesting that these are real parallel states that the person is interacting with, and they shift back to the version you and I know with the same atoms and the same structure, but their consciousness can shift into these different Lagrangian streams, and each reality is its distinct reality. It's real in and of itself. Some people are able to shift like that more than most of us. Before Rubens channeled Dr. Fritz, there was this guy, Z. Arrigo, who channeled him. Now, the thing about all the people who've channeled Dr. Fritz is they've all died in violent car crashes. And they were all told this by Dr. Fritz, that they would all die in violent, and it all happened. It hasn't happened to Rubens yet, as far as I know. I met a woman at a conference in Miami last May, a consciousness conference. It was the AIC. They're from Europe, based in Portugal. And I gave a presentation on a related subject like this. And there was a woman there that had known Z. Arrigo and Rubens and had worked with them. And I got lots of pictures of the psychic surgery. But it's, again, if you accept that this is real and stop trying to debunk it, what would explain it, okay? Then there's people like Luis Gasparotto. There's a great video you can watch on YouTube called UFOs and Channeling, hosted by Telly Savalas, for real, from the 80s. Well, the interesting thing about Gasparotto is he can channel 20 different famous painters. And when they show his paintings to experts, they say it looks just like the original masters, who obviously are not alive anymore. And how do you explain something like that? Someone that could actually physically create paintings in the style of the great, classical painters over the centuries. And it's so good that experts in New York City at the art museum say this looks to me like an original. Okay, so there's some sort of continuum of creativity. That's how I look at it. And you and I all experience this to some degree. I would suggest that RV on this continuum is a shade of that, right? Now, people that actually do RV and feel that they're at the target site, at least one interpretation of that, bilocation, right? Even though I know some people refer to bilocation just as the regular RV state. But you have people like Lynn or Joe McMonagle or others who told us these stories from their famous viewings when they, actually felt like they were at the site, so much that when they visited it later, they knew the town perfectly or something like that. Okay, so there's this range of interaction from the point of view of this model I'm presenting to you, of these interaction with these parallel realities. You could just stay on your own reality, or you can kind of shift. Some people, as we've seen at Marty's, at the conferences, right, at Green Valley, we've been told that people that have actually had brain injury are actually better at RV. Both, I think this has come up at AbFest and IRVA, right? Mm-hmm. So it suggests that what our conscious mind is doing, it's very good at sticking to the particular reality we're in. Nothing wrong with that, okay? We all have to deal with situations every day that require our attention to be right here, right now. But people that have had this slight injury can somehow connect more to these parallel realities more easily. That's what I'm suggesting here. That's just the way the model would explain it. Now, everyone knows who this is, right? Vince Damon Fournier, right? Alice Cooper. Now, again, I read about this, I study because I know it relates to channeling a little bit and different personalities. And actually, I play guitar too, not like Alice Cooper. It still seems like the Simeon you know and love. It's not that different a person, slightly different. But what was interesting about Alice is he put together this movie called Super Duper Alice Cooper. And a lot of these rock musicians are really tormented by their lives, right? It was no exception for Vincent Alice Cooper. The Alice Cooper character was so destructive that he actually, his wife divorced him for a while. He got multiple time in rehab clinics, first for alcohol, then cocaine. The way he got back to being the Alice that on the lower right, who's a family man now, plays golf and so forth, is a good golfer, very good golfer, and it can function. He had to draw a line in the sand for Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper was someone he could become on stage, and then when he's off stage, he becomes Vincent again. Otherwise, it was too destructive. They're both real people in the same body, right? And the same thing with famous actors that you and I know, like Jeremy Brett, Sherlock Holmes. I mean, Jeremy Brett is considered to be like probably the best Sherlock Holmes we've ever had. He was on the PBS series, what was the PBS line? They had the mystery shows, and I watched Jeremy. I used to love watching Jeremy Brett. My brother's named after him, by the way, Jeremy. But he's a great actor. But he said that you kind of absorb the character like a liquid, right? What does that sound like from Lagrangian dynamics, right? Real liquids. We're not talking. See, as I'm suggesting to you here, this is not metaphor. This is real. That the other Sherlock Holmes character is a real character that Jeremy Brett, a good actor, is capable of coming in contact with. And you kind of squeeze yourself out of your own character and absorb the other character. But it doesn't end there, because Jeremy Brett said he couldn't stop being Sherlock Holmes. He actually moved in to Baker Street, the same residence that Sherlock Holmes would have lived in, 100 years ago. He found that residence. He moved in there. He began smoking. He began using drugs like Sherlock Holmes did. And he said before he died that it all got too dangerous, and it killed him in the end. Okay, because he ended up dying far too young, and he was living like Sherlock Holmes was. He actually became the character. So I would suggest that it's a real character. It's not just a way of talking. Going back to von Neumann's psychophysical parallelism, that these subjective states are real states. I think that this is evidence for psychophysical parallelism. That's what I'm suggesting. All these examples I'm giving you, it's just anecdotal, but it adds up to a lot of weight, so to speak, for this interpretation, that these parallel states, when you see it in your imagination, an alternative state, it's real somewhere. It doesn't mean it has necessarily any impact on your world, but it could. And it's something to pay attention to. So this is kind of like the idea that when you're imagining things, that it could have a pressure enough to interact with your world. And pressure is enough to create all sorts of very interesting effects in crystals and liquids and so forth. So this model says it actually creates our physical reality. It can. Steve Johnson's book, he talks about the adjacent possible. He's trying to see, where do new ideas come from, right? And he talks about the development of the printing press, Gutenberg and so forth. And Gutenberg had a lot of friends who worked in the wine industry, right? And they adapted the wine press and turned it into a printing press. So Steve Johnson comes up with this idea that there's this, just as a metaphor, there's this adjacent possibilities that are around us. I'm saying those adjacent possibilities, according to MIW, are real realities. They're not just in your mind. They're not totally subjective. They're the way von Neumann would have looked at it, Everett. They're real realities. And sometimes they have some interaction with you. Some people seem better than others at interacting with these realities. I think it also could explain pair lab results, right? All of these studies that Bob and Brenda did over the years at pair labs in Princeton, showing that there's this micro PK effect, right? That when you focus your intent on a random number generator, that it tilts in that direction just slightly, but after, billions and millions of trials, 300, I think 70,000 total trials, each one consisting of multiple experiments, you get these, results of billions to one, that is by chance, that, that you're affecting the action of a random number generator, or even these little balls they have. I think these are what are these called again? These Pinocchio balls or something, like they fall randomly. Well, they
Right.
found that even someone sitting in a chair can affect the distribution left or right. They found it with every system they ever looked at. They didn't do this just because they thought it'd be interesting. I mean, there was an undergrad who said she wanted to study this, and Bob thought it was garbage, basically. But he let her do it, and she got the results. And then they got a grant from McDonnell Douglas because those guys were consider what's the effect if a pilot gets really mad in their plane, like their emotions, right, on the machinery. And they found that this is the effect, and they found it stronger in bonded pairs, men and women. That if two people are focusing on the random number generator, and that they are related to each other in an intimate way, it's a stronger effect. So that would, again, from the MIW perspective, you've got two systems that are same configuration space, double the effect. It's just an outcome of the Lagrangian dynamics. Then there's Larry Dossey's twin studies. Larry at the SSE, if you're familiar with his work, or you should be if you're not, that he's done a lot of work on telepathy and precognition, and he found that twins have a lot more of this. He's a twin himself, and he found that there's an incredible amount of telepathic interaction between twins and other types of effects that are not explainable by any sort of classical and mechanical model. And this would kind of work with that too, because twins would be in the same physical configuration space, so they're going to be interacting more. Basically, the more you're at resonance with something else, the more you're going to get that interaction. And I'm sure you've all experienced this too with loved ones, just kind of knowing something without having talked to them, things like that. There's that book by, I'll remember it by the end of the talk. It's called, it's a book about extreme explorers and how their loved ones sometimes know when they've been involved in an accident from thousands of miles away, or people that get premonitions before going up Mount Everest and they don't do it, and the other people don't listen to them, things like that, where extreme, and didn't Harold Sherman do this when he was doing his canoe trip, right? And he had someone he had a telepathic receiver, and he was doing this kind of extreme canoe trip in Canada, and people have other people have mentioned this. It's kind of people involved with extremes often get this natural empathic connection to loved ones and so forth. Same idea. So basically, what this model would suggest, and this is my interpretation of it, I'm probably the only one arguing this right now that I've heard, so you can kind of dismiss all of it if you want. But to me, it makes sense, is that what we're dealing with is kind of quantized consciousness. When you're in your particular world or doing your RV session, you're in kind of one state or another. It kind of quantizes. That's what quantum really means. It's kind of this or that. It's not kind of a blend. And it seems real to you. And then you shift into another state and another state. But it's at the moment, it seems really distinct, and that's the only world you perceive. That's sort of what we see here. We don't see part Vince, part Alice Cooper. It's either one or the other, right? People with dissociative identity disorder. And I've spoken to people who lived around people with DID, people who know people with DID. They tell me all this stuff I'm describing is absolutely what it's like. They're either one personality or another. It's not a little blend. It's not like mix it a little bit. It's either one or the other. It's quantized. Okay. So you have to ask yourself, are you a multi-visual or an individual, right? We're biased in our society to think a multi-visual, that's weird, right? But maybe that's really what's going on. It's just our social convention gives us a coherent identity. Those of us that do RV have to let ourselves feel okay to let go of that identity temporarily while reviewing, right? At least that's my experience of it. Your ego mind has to let go of micromanaging your session, or you won't get a very good session. You have to let something take over, something else. And so there's a lot of benefits it seems to me, to recognize that this could be what the reality, what we're living with, what we are, is multi-visuals, that it's okay, as long as it's not destructive, to have a range. I think we all do have a range of personalities anyway. I mean, I know, again, as I mentioned, when I'm playing guitar, people enjoy my guitar music and so forth. It's on iTunes, people write to me and stuff. But it's a slightly different version of Simeon than the one who's giving you the talk now. It's not radically different. It look the same and everything. But I know when I'm playing, I feel different because something else is kind of going through me, and I have to get out of the way to let it happen. Just kind of like the channeling state. So that's what this is suggesting, that our world is mostly classical, maybe, talking classical mechanics, Newtonian, Lagrangian, but it's partly interdimensional. I don't know, Marty, or the rest of you, what the percentage is. I've kind of imagined, well, what would it be, Simeon? And what percent is class? I don't know, is it like 99.5% classical and 0.5% interdimensional? For me, just like an average person, not super gifted, psychically or anything like that. What would it be for Ingo Swann or something? I don't know exactly, but what I'm thinking now is there's a continuum between classical and multidimensional reality. And what we get is a little multidimensionality that is blended in. And there is a really good physics phenomena that supports this 100%, our Aharonov-Bohm effect. This is one of the most freaking fascinating things you could ever find out in quantum physics, is that if you take a magnetic solenoid and you completely shield it, it's completely enclosed magnetic field, so you will not detect any magnetism with any classical measuring device. You can have all the magnetometers there you want, it won't detect anything. But if a subatomic particle goes by this magnet that's totally shielded, it will pick up, if a neutral particle goes by, it will pick up the same spin phase as, or the same orientation as the magnetic field, even though there's no magnetic field there. So basically nothing can influence something. Or another way to look at it is that a potential for something can actually interact with a physical particle. Again, going back to psychophysical parallelism. And it kind of fits this model perfectly, especially since this kind of comes out of some of Bohm's ideas, but more because it suggests that a possibility has a real effect on physical stuff. That's what our Aharonov-Bohm means to me. And there was just this whole article about it in Science a couple weeks ago with these ultra cold systems and the quantum studying quantum effects. But the really interesting thing that came out of this to me is that there's actually a frequency signature for Aharonov-Bohm called the Berry curvature. And this is what I was imagining when I was going to explain this to you, because Marty wanted me to. We agreed to do this talk a couple months ago. I'm thinking, well, what would be a test to show that this is not just you talking, Simeon, that it really works this way, right? That there is a multiverse effect, because people always say, you've heard it, it's just philosophy, there's no evidence. But if there were evidence, what would it look like? It would look like the Berry curvature a little bit. Just as an example, normally in our world, physical systems are often described by a bell curve, right? Normal physical solid systems, kind of many systems are described by a bell curve, growth of any living thing or something like this, many processes, distributions of statistical phenomena and so forth often have this bell curve. But if you're getting more multidimensional effects, it's going to start looking more like a Berry curvature just at the edges. So I think now we could have a test. If you could look at data, you could tell what percent is multidimensional and what is just purely classical, right? It would be on a scale. And I couldn't draw it out for you ahead of time. I wanted to show you, but just imagine a line. On the left, it's classical Newtonian, and on the right, it's multidimensional. Pick whatever version of multiverse you want, but something like that. You're going to find more of a fractal-looking bell curve, which looks a lot like this Berry curvature signature from a multiverse interaction, because potentials are interacting with physical stuff, just potentials. This is why you can get an ARV target a week ahead, because the potential is there. You've sat down and decided to do it. There's two choices. And it's starting to influence you right now in the so-called past. And this sort of Berry curvature indicates that. So just hypothetically, I'm thinking at a meta level, could we see this if we were able to get the right data to show that we have a statistical distribution that's showing evidence of multidimensionality? That's just on the top of my head what I've been thinking about ways of showing this could be real, going beyond the idea that this is just philosophy like Copenhagen and quantum, waves and so forth. That's kind of philosophy. But what evidence would show us that we're actually in a MIW type world or some version of that? I'm not saying it has to be MIW, something like that, version of that. Maybe we could find evidence that it's real. So this point of view actually weirdly seems consistent with a lot of different points of view. It fits in with a lot of different points of view, even the kind of determinism, because it's saying that it is sort of deterministic, but it's just so incredibly complex, you can't predict it ahead of time. Too many parallel realities interacting. I mean, you can just get away with modeling a couple parallel realities, as I showed you with the double slit models a couple slides back. And even if you read, science literature, there's this idea that there's a leak. I mean, this is kind of what we're saying, right? That there's these bleed through, that reality kind of leaks a little bit, and things bleed through from other dimensions. This has been actually found empirically, is that particles streaming across the cosmos, by the time they get to our sensors here, they're missing a little energy that they shouldn't be. And new scientists, again, suggest that they're bumping up against another reality. I mean, this is their own words, possibly, and they're losing a little energy. Again, this fits MIW ideas. This fits this kind of parallel reality idea. And then other evidence, I just came across this a couple days ago from Science magazine, is that light particles, when they come across to our solar system, they seem to have a directionality to the spin of the light, the phase of the light. It seems to have, if it was just coming from everywhere in the universe, it should just cancel out, but it doesn't. It has a directionality. And the conclusion of this article is there's an extragalactic influence on that, affecting the light that we don't know about. Well, maybe it's parallel realities. And one last thing to think about is, you've heard about dark energy, dark matter, right? So dark energy is the force, mysterious force, 68% of the universe that holds galaxies together, because there's not enough physical matter. If you look out with your physical eyes, you'll see there's not enough physical matter to hold everything together, but somehow it holds together. Dark energy is this force that pushes everything apart, but no one knows what it is. And it's not explainable by the 4 fundamental laws of physics either. At least most people don't think so. So what could be creating that repulsion that creates dark energy? That's about 35%. I mean, we don't know what 95% of even our known universe is. It's mostly dark energy and dark matter, and no one knows. Even to this day, nobody has any clue what those are. Maybe parallel realities, because we're talking about repulsive effects, are creating some of that dark energy effect. That's why we get this repulsive effect. I don't know. It's just speculation. A lot of this is speculation, but what I've been hoping to show you today is that this is not just philosophy. This is not just a metaphor, that there's bits of evidence, again, from the way our personalities work and from some of these different phenomena channeling, that suggest that it's consistent with this point of view. That's what I'm saying, just consistent with a parallel reality approach. Doesn't necessarily mean it's right, but it's consistent with it, and I think it does a lot better than some of the other points of view. So I think that does it. But before we go to questions, I just want to share one experience I had just yesterday, 2 days ago, that it just reinforces this. I was visiting some friends in Omak, Washington, a remote viewer and her boyfriend who live up there. And I was going around this curve. It was starting to get dark. And all of a sudden, this image of a deer popped in my mind, very detailed, like it would in an RV session. I could see the eye and the colors. I could face to it and everything like that. But very full-blown, large in my mind. And I thought, did I see something? I look around. There's nothing there. There's no deer there. I look out and I see a kind of a stick in a log in the field, the same color. I thought, maybe I made it up. And then about 75 yards down the road, in a place that I couldn't have physically seen from where I was when I had the image, was that exact deer. And 2 of his buddies waiting to cross the road. That deer was just waiting there to cross. And it was the exact thing I saw in my mind, but from a position on the road, I don't think I could have physically seen. And there he was. I stopped the car. He walked across, then his buddy. They were all kind of adolescent male deer. And then the third guy walked across. And it was just an example of the practical benefits of being involved in this area, whatever the actual explanation of how it works. Because when you get an image like that, those of us who've been in RV involved with this, right, you pay attention to that now. You would like to believe you pay attention to it. In this case, I did. I slowed down, and then I saw, but I couldn't have seen it from that path. So what was that? I mean, anyway, I'll leave it to you. But I think at the end of the day, this has a big practical benefit, whatever the explanation turns out to be. And I just hope maybe this explanation makes sense of some of this more than it did before we had the talk. Anyway, that's about it. So any questions or anything?
Okay, Simeon, thank you so much. That was quite interesting. Usually
Yeah.
I open it up to everybody else to ask questions, but I'm going to I'm going to go first here.
No, go ahead.
And then we'll open it up. I have a couple
Yeah, sure.
for you. First of all, how did the cold fusion? What is your connection with cold fusion? With this
Thank you,
multiple
Marty.
words, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, I put the slide in, and I guess I had a little confusion about the 2 presentations, so it ended up in, it should have ended up in here. I had a slide
Mm-hmm.
of Fleischmann and Pons, because this is something I've studied extensively, and I've heard experts talking about it. Yeah, the slide did not. It should have been right here. Thank you for bringing that up. Fleischmann and Pons, I think I even have the picture still up. Well, Fleischmann and Pons were these two. Okay, we don't. Fleischmann and Pons were these two scientists from the University of Utah. They claimed in '89 to have discovered a cold fusion type reaction, which is basically it's producing something like fusion, which is what makes the sun work. And scientists here have been spending billions of dollars attempting to get it to work on Earth, but it's never worked for more than about a trillionth of a second, literally. It's never worked for more than about a trillionth of a second. So the dream is, can you get it at a room temperature with ordinary equipment, tabletop equipment, not huge things? And they claimed to get this in '89. No one could reproduce their results the way they had done it. And there was this kind of witch hunt to try to discredit it. A lot of hot fusion people that were at MIT didn't like it, and they really wanted to kill it, and they did. But it turns out it really does work. I heard a presentation by Dr. Vittorio Violante at the SSC meeting in San Francisco, I believe it was 2014. And he told us, he was the invited keynote speaker for the talk, and he said, uncategorically it works. There's no doubt it works. They've been able to reproduce it in Italy at the government labs there. He said they're all hot fusion people, but they wanted to give it a chance. And what they found is that it could take a week or more for the reaction to get going, but you have to get just the right materials. The materials have to be slightly impure. It's created with palladium, which is a heavy metal, and deuterium type of water, heavy water and palladium, and that group of palladium metals. You have to contaminate the palladium with other metals so it's not too pure, which is what Fleischmann and Pons were using. Give it enough time and you do get excess heat that can't be explained easily. Now, what made it relevant to our talk here is he said it's not a chemical reaction, it's based on resonance. It's purely creating energy out of resonance between the chemical elements there somehow. No one's sure exactly why it could work, even if it is fusion, but somehow you get this kind of loading of the water or whatever serves as to hold the hydrogen atoms fit in there, and it resonates in a way that creates a lot of energy. And there has never really been a good explanation of what this could be. It's, by the way, it has come up again in a new form. It's called low energy nuclear reaction, LENR. You can look it up online. I mentioned that site ECAT World that I like to read every couple of days with the latest experiments in LENR. It's a real paradigm busting types of physics. The Sean Carrolls of the world had said it's impossible because it violates the fundamental laws. But people like Andrea Rossi and others who are working on his own device, he calls it the ECAT, and he has a new one that he calls the Quark X or the QX. He's going to give a demonstration in November. It's still controversial. Some people say they know it works. They've seen it work. We don't have the definitive proof that it can be sustained for months on end. But we know, I mean, the people at SPA War in San Diego from the Navy have reproduced it many times, lots of labs in Israel. So if it were to work, it's another resonance type interaction.
Okay, I'd like you to connect. I think I have a sense. I mean, I know what resonance is physically. Okay, you get this extra energy, but to connect it with this multiple interacting worlds concept, you're saying you're starting out close to another world, but then you resonate with it more strongly, so it becomes real in this world. Use your words to connect resonance with this MIW.
Yeah, and actually, you had the word contact there too in the title.
Right, and you didn't discuss that.
Yes, I had a slide of an extraterrestrial drawing image to connect all this. And I mean, again, as I said at the beginning of the talk, these are all resonance-based phenomena. They're all the same phenomena from a different point of view. Let me put it that way. The way it might explain it let me give you an example from plants, ordinary plants that you and I have around in our houses and grow on Earth and so forth. There have been a number of articles over the years that suggest that plants, when they absorb photons, as part of the reactions they use to create energy, right? Photosynthesis. That they hold the photons there for a few nanoseconds longer than they need to keep it in a superposition, so that they can get just the right energy out of it that they want. So they want a different, light comes in at a certain frequency, they may want another frequency, but from the Copenhagen point of view, they hold it in a superposition and then it manifests into the photon that they want it to be. From a many worlds point of view, there would be multiple parallel possibilities that the plants would actually be doing this too. I know this is kind of a stretch, but you have to follow it, and then it'll answer your question, Marty. That they're holding the photons in multiple parallel realities and kind of just selecting one out that they seem to want, that they can sense that. That's just what it suggests. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but if you don't go with Copenhagen, you go with many worlds, then you're saying it's not that it's in a superposition. All the possibilities are real, all the possible phase states of that particle. Similarly with cold fusion.
Well, wait, but okay, they're all real. I get that.
Yeah.
But right. And I've actually I've used the fact that there's a quantum mechanical effect in photosynthesis because it's so efficient. But connect this now with the multiple worlds. They're all there. Why does the optimum world then always for the plants turn out to be this world? There's some.
Well, that's just the one that we see. There's also the other ones we don't see. There's the ones that we don't see. We just see this version of it. The plant, the particle came in with multiple frequencies, multiple possibilities, and it kind of came down the chute, turned into one frequency that the plant wanted at the time. But it basically started out with multiple possibilities. The cold fusion, it's a resonant type interaction. In other words, you have these chemical elements resonating together. Once they're able to establish that resonance, it would not necessarily be confined just to our world anymore. It could spill over into some of the neighboring parallel realities, and some of the energy could be coming from that reality onto the tabletop. That's what I'm suggesting as a possibility.
Okay, when you say they resonate, I really want to, you have to, first of all, I want you to know I'm coming from a position where this is really a very interesting interpretation.
Yeah.
I mean, I really like it. The multiple. We just had last week a guy who talked about the multiple personalities. So this is sort of interesting that they're really real, but the resonance connect for me. The resonance with the multi worlds, a cold fusion. Use the word resonance that somehow things get going. Okay. Where does the multi-worlds come in?
Because with the energy equations, Marty, with cold fusion, you can't make it, it doesn't add up with what we know from conventional physics. That's why a lot of physicists can't believe that cold fusion is possible, right?
Right.
The equations don't add up to excess energy from the 4 known laws of physics. And they conclude, like Sean Carroll, it's impossible, right? I don't need to look at it. Don't bother me with the facts. I know it can't be true. But if you allow for the fact that some of that energy is bouncing off of other parallel realities in very similar configuration spaces, you could end up with overunity, with excess energy beyond what you're just getting from that single system that you measure in a classical way. That's where the extra energy could be coming from. It could be, in other words, the reaction could be going beyond our particular reality in the same way that, just like what I'm suggesting is that the cold fusion reactor is like Alice Cooper, if you can imagine that. There's multiple personalities for that system. It's all variations of resonance, and they are all characteristic of that system if you look at it from an extra-dimensional point of view. And the people who suggested this, I'm suggesting from MIW point of view, that's what it's suggesting.
I'm listening to the words, and please, I understand. The personality one, I really get. That fits your model very nicely. But what you're saying here with the fusion is you're picking it up from another world that maybe has somewhat different physics. Again, I'm trying to use the multi-world model here, and you'd almost have to say you're getting the extra energy because you're now crossing over, resonating. The word resonate, I don't. But I guess that means
Marty, they're resonating coherently together, these parallel realities. So instead of just having one single reality stream,
Oh,
And
so
we
the
say,
fact you
look,
have
we've got
more than
palladium, we've got
one
deuterium,
resonating gives you
can't
more
get enough
energy.
energy from that system. It doesn't exist, right? That's what they say according to the weak force. Okay, you're not going
Okay.
to get it from the. But let's say we just throw in 10 or 20 parallel realities, and they're coherently resonating together like a crystal. Because the challenge with cold fusion is to get it to be a self-sustaining reaction, right?
Right.
To
And
get it to the
so,
point where it sustains itself on the tabletop past a few seconds.
mhm.
Hot fusion, they can never get it to self-sustain past a trillionth of a second. The view is always it's going to be about 10 years away. It's always been about 10 years away ever since I was a kid.
Right.
But this is, let's say we imagine 10 parallel streams and they're kind of coherently resonating together. You're going to get more energy, and then you can see from your own particular reality. And I'm suggesting that is one possibility.
Okay.
My
Okay.
view, based on
Mhm.
Vittorio, it's a resonance reaction, not chemical, and our physics doesn't deal very well with that.
Right.
But
And when
if
you
you
use the
throw in a couple,
word when you use
yep,
the word resonance, just you really, to use my words, are
yep,
saying that you've got these multiple dimensions
yeah,
acting at the same time. So you now have the opportunity for these other effects.
yeah.
And
In other words, Marty, the resonance is triggering an interaction past our particular world into some other parallel realities. They're very the worlds that we're dealing with from the MIW model are very similar to ours. That's the only way the model can make them work, is
right.
because they're so similar in configuration space. But if the energy is resonating and it's interacting and it becomes, it resonates enough to generate like a tuning fork, the other tuning
Right.
forks begin to act. You can still keep entropy and all that stuff you like, but if you add in 10 realities versus one, maybe I'm suggesting maybe that explains why you get that effect at all.
No.
Barring
Okay.
the fact that no one else comes, there isn't, and I've read so many of them, I'm saying this is one possibility,
No, I
that it's
understand. I'm trying to
multidimensional.
understand the explanation, and
Indeed.
that
Yep.
fits. And
And one,
ETs.
yeah, let
Okay.
me, sorry, I want to apologize. I had these, and I made the mistake this morning of um, bringing in,
You mixed
uh,
up two of them. That's okay.
I'm just mixing up two slides. It can happen when you are improving another lecture and you're deleting and
I
deleting.
know.
And okay, so we did have, just to prove it, we did have um, cold fusion back here, Fleischmann and Pons, right? You can see that.
Right. Right.
Again, just what happened to these guys is so incredible. They were driven out of the country. And there was this witch hunt, and now it turns out that they might have been right the whole time, but no one else was patient enough
Yep.
to let the effect.
Let it go.
Yeah. So here's the other idea is
There you go.
extraterrestrial. So thank you, Marty. I really appreciate this question. So I forgot to bring this in. What would this imply about extraterrestrials? Okay. From the point of view of this model, what it suggests to me, and again, I'm just exploring the tip of the iceberg here.
Hmm.
What we may be calling extraterrestrials could be other versions of our own reality, ourselves, that are in parallel realities that to us seem like extraterrestrials. Now, I'm not saying people aren't coming here in their spaceships from other places, but I've talked to John Alexander. I've heard John Alexander give great lectures about this. Jacques Vallée, others,
Hmm.
who suggest that we don't understand what this phenomena is. It's absolutely real. Tom DeLonge and his group just had their presentation a couple of days ago. Their To the Stars Academy.
Hmm.
Hal Puthoff is part of that, by the way.
That was
Yes.
amazing. I know. I shared that with our group. Hmm.
So this is coming out. Now, what I'm suggesting, a la perhaps John Alexander, Jacques Vallée, and others, is not that extraterrestrials aren't real, and not in the least, but there could be more to it than that. That what we're calling extraterrestrials and UFOs could be other versions of our own reality, neighboring parallel realities to Earth with other versions of you and me that are so different, Marty, that we don't see them as us anymore. They seem like ETs.
Hmm.
That is one part of the phenomena that we're experiencing on Earth, which is why some of these interaction abduction cases seem to go on for generations through families and things like that. That it really is very particular to that family, something to do with them. And it really could be them in another parallel reality interact. Again, it's hypothetical. It's just another way to look at the phenomena, is saying maybe it's not just all from outside the Earth. Maybe it's from parallel Earths, parallel
Okay.
worlds.
And see,
That's it.
time, this model also
Yeah.
says that time in a way could shift such that it's just simply a parallel universe that's shifted such that you're looking, a day ahead when we're
Yeah,
doing remote.
exactly.
So that would
Well,
be a shift in time, but a
no,
real parallel universe.
right, Marty, because this, again, the model, MIW model, I mean, let's be realistic about it. They say that the parallel realities we're most likely to interact with are the ones that are very similar to ours, but that doesn't mean they're exactly similar. And it, just like you're saying, it could be just
Right.
one day different. And there's your feedback target, but it's now in a parallel reality. You had that interaction
Right.
and you saw it now, but the way we see it from a linear point of view, it's tomorrow.
Okay, let me ask you one last question, sort of a technical question, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. And that is, when you were talking about the equations, you've given a really good interpretation, as good as any of the other interpretations, and you've given some really good examples.
Yep.
However, does the mathematics, and you sort of implied that if you take a few parallel universes, you can match a double slit experiment, and
Yep.
ultimately, if you take thousands, you can get as close as you'd like to normal quantum mechanics. That's been shown mathematically, and
Absolutely.
with what new uh, what is the new equation they bring in? You're giving it to me in words, but is there a new mathematical assumption that has to come
No,
in?
it all comes out of Lagrangian dynamics. And you know how this started, Marty? A lot of these guys started. Henry Poirier in Texas. I've interacted with him a little bit about this, and I follow what he's doing. It
Mm-hmm.
came out of hydrodynamics. Like, let's say we model this quantum process as if it's a liquid, right?
Do you know
A,
that
a
that's
lot
what
of
I
this.
did in my whole career? I went into
This is what you did.
multi-phase. That I used
Yeah, yeah,
the
it came out of that
computer. And I know the
modeling.
Lagrange. We used to call it Lagrange, not Lagrange. I don't know who's pronouncing it, but that doesn't
Well,
matter.
I'm just giving the French pronunciation because I had too many
Okay.
years of French.
Okay. And that's probably correct. That's what he calls himself. So you're saying using the Lagrange um, kind of mathematical formulation
Yeah,
applied to quantum mechanics, um, with the multiverse sort of model in mind, then this mathematics of multiple taking specific ones and getting more and more all follows naturally.
yeah. Here's the article right here. Quantum mechanics without wave functions. Again, you're a physicist. I'm
Right.
just, statistician, sociologist. I'm doing the best I can with it. But this is what they're literally saying: is that it's you model it from real, trajectories, as if it were, instead of just one stream of hydrodynamic modeling, you imagine there's parallel versions of it that are weakly interacting.
Mm-hmm.
The shocking thing that all these guys were shocked with is you actually end up with the exact same predictions of quantum mechanics. And then you got to wonder, well, what is creating these quantum effects if you can get it from a different point of view that's simpler? It doesn't have as many assumptions built in. It just falls out. Okay, it does have parallel
Well, I was
realities.
going to
Yeah.
say the only assumption is
The only one is that parallel.
reality.
Okay,
But I
it's
get it.
true.
No, but
This is not an attempt to overly simplify this. This is not an attempt to get rid of it.
right.
Marty, when I was in undergraduate, we read books by classical physicists trying to explain away Einstein from a Newtonian point of view,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's wrong. It doesn't work in the end. But
Right.
it's not an attempt to get rid of it. It's just saying, look, you can use an alternative modeling, and you end up with the exact same data that we all know and love
Okay.
within the boundaries of what you can model. With a couple parallel realities, it gets very complicated. But it starts out with hydrodynamics, and you end up with the same thing as if there's a wave function there, but you don't start with the wave.
Well, plus it explains things which the other one would not have any way
I
of
think I think
explaining.
it
The
does.
multiple personality one, the dissociative identity one, is the best example that of all this, at least of
Yeah.
all the stuff you said now, that resonates with me, of your interpretation fitting that really beautifully. Um, so that's sort of cool. And why it takes trauma for this to happen.
Right.
I wish we could understand that, but that's cool. Um, okay, now
That's
one I
can I
guess
just say
is
one thing
one.
about that?
Yeah,
One more thing.
yeah.
You're kind of right about the trauma point. And other, I think even Russell Target said this a number of times, is that being really good at RV is not necessarily something you want to be good at. You could choose to be good at this, but people who have trauma are good at this, right?
Right.
So
But
you maybe want to be content with the level of RV that you have
well, no,
and
but
not,
no. I want it because that was just my next question. A
yeah,
really good model makes new predictions and suggests new things to do, and that was going to be my next question. What if
yeah.
you haven't had a trauma? What does this model say about becoming better at remote viewing, being better at associative remote viewing? How can I hook in to the correct future as opposed to a displaced future? Does this model give any suggestions about that?
Well, look, in Silicon Valley right now, it's very popular. You've heard about the micro LSD doses. Uh,
No, but
yes, there
okay.
people in Silicon Valley are experimenting with hallucinogens again. I've talked
Okay.
to people who know about this. Micro doses
Okay.
to break off the patterns to get more creativity, right?
Right.
There's people that take Provigil, modafinil. It's a
Mhm.
type of amphetamine you can
Right.
get with prescription. It helps you stay focused for a while. I know people have used it who have narcolepsy, when they're driving, things like this. But there's a slight cost to that too. Nobody knows what it is with Mondat. No one knows why it works. And again, with hallucinogens, I'm not against it or anything. I've never done anything quite like that. That could be good for, but I think everyone has to kind of find the way to do that that already fits in with the person that they like being, or at least has to be a choice.
But the
Because
model
what this
doesn't
model,
suggest.
no, I don't think this model is going to, you're going to like what it says. My interpretation of it, and again, this is just one interpretation, is that it's a kind of a sliding scale. And um, you're pretty much, again, it's mostly classical. You're pretty much in your classical Newtonian world with some level of multidimensionality that we all experience. I gave you the example of seeing the deer in my mind, like a remote viewing experience about 20 seconds before it could have been a collision just
Right.
2 days ago. Now, um, I don't know really the answer that if I was more in that realm, more telepathic, I would maybe avoid all animal collisions. I've had some here and there, and they're very unpleasant, right? Unless I could avoid all those, would I be as good at something that requires immediate focus in my life right now? Is it a sliding scale, or can you have both through evolution over time?
Okay,
It's a
I'm
good
going
question.
to and let me give you the answer to my question. And you
Okay.
actually gave it. But it comes out of your model, even though other people have found it a long time ago. Act, I can't remember who you associated it with, but the idea of acting as if you are already a good remote viewer.
Right.
You
Right.
act that way, you believe that deeply, would fit with resonating then with that other world that's out there where that is in
Where
fact
it's true.
so.
Where it's true. Yeah.
Your model would say that's the answer to my question. That's what you should do because then you're going to move into that state.
Yeah. I think that's an acceptable answer to it. You just act as if. Um,
Right, as if
uh,
that was the book. Right, right,
yeah, the Richard Wiseman book. Yeah,
right.
you act as if. It just depends on what you want. If you see, I think you can become a better remote viewer without necessarily increasing your psychic ability because it's already built in. It's more like you've got equipment that you need to learn how to use better. You need to take the time to figure out how it
And
works.
so
And
act
that,
as if you're already that person.
yeah, you don't need to. In other words, you don't need to change to become.
No.
It's already there. You just need the way you become better at
Right,
anything else in life,
right.
right? That's challenging. Same way.
Okay, and one last thing to get on the
Okay.
record, and then I promise I'll open it up.
No, it's good.
um,
These are good questions.
and that is when you talked about black energy and black
Dark
matter,
energy. Yeah, dark
dark
energy. Yeah.
energy, you have to know that um, connected to the way you put it. I would say it somewhat differently, but it is related, and that is that all comes down to consciousness. The multiple dimensions, which are different vibrational states of consciousness. I think they're playing themselves out in our universe through dark energy and dark matter.
Interesting. Yeah.
Hmm. And it's just using different words for the same unknown. But I would like to go down to consciousness is fundamental with all of this, which fits still with everything that you're saying.
Well, Marty, that's interesting. None of these guys talk about consciousness, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's not real for physicists. The physicists I know, they always try to explain it like the brain's like this. What do they call it? A lazy piece of meat.
Yeah. Okay.
Nothing could be further from the truth.
Of course.
It's a demeaning thing to say to brains to refer. I know what they're talking about, but what this model implies, and it's not part of what they're saying. And if those physicists that are the physicists that created these models that I presented to you now would not agree with what I'm about to say. But I think it implies that the consciousness is the fundamental thing, and it moves through all these frames of parallel realities, giving you this experience of a lifetime and so forth. But it would have to imply that the consciousness is outside of any of these things. You don't get it from Lagrangian dynamics, do you?
No, but
here we are having
exactly.
a talk, so something else has to be going on that this model doesn't explain.
That's right.
And
but some people use the word subjectivity. That's consciousness. So
yeah, it's obviously there's so much we don't know about it. Yeah. But to finalize it, what is interesting about this model, and then we'll go to the question. It does seem to touch on a lot of really interesting things, all the way from dark energy to RV. It's interesting, and that's what you're looking for in science. Is one thing that simplifies everything.
Right, and I like that very much, Simeon. Thank you.
Yeah,
really, thank you.
That's why I keep working on it. Go ahead.
Okay, open up. Anybody else? Go ahead. Turn on your mic and.
Okay, Terry Anderson here. Hi, Sim. Hey. Hi, Marty.
Hi, Terry.
Very interesting discussion. From a layman's terms, because I haven't been trained in classical physics or mathematics, my traumatic near-death experience in 1986 left me with profound memories of being outside time and space with three beings in a telepathic exchange that left me with profound memories and insights and psychic abilities and time travel experiences where I was taken out of my body and into the future on a curved light beam, traveling at tremendous speed, and then coming back to my body as a 1.5 foot ball of plasma, sparkling plasma that dissipated into my chest. And I phoned a lawyer and a dentist and told them what I had witnessed, these 3 fingers being removed. 2 weeks later, I was on the beach with a dentist who introduced me to his brother, who's a surgeon, who reported he had to remove 3 fingers from a patient. And so the dentist looked at me with horror, and I kind of backed up from myself because I realized that I had been taken into the future 2 weeks. So yeah. I totally understand from my near-death experience that everything is frequency, although, Sim, you call it resonance. I experienced it as frequencies. Everything is different frequency, including time travel. And I experienced, a portal opening up in front of me, and quantum foam, and wave function, and UFO, being on a UFO, and these multiple screens in front of me of all of these different images of the future, and then experiencing these future events happening in the order that I was shown, and very advanced computer chip design, and meetings with various politicians that then happened in order. So, yeah. I understand quantum physics at a very experiential level, not at a level of educational training. But
that's
for me, it speaks to frequency.
Okay, well, thank you for that comment, Terry. Very interesting.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? Questions, comments?
I would just say, about that. I mean, what Terry is saying is very important. It's something that we experience, right?
Right.
And any academic discipline likes to make itself feel special. There isn't one that's exempt from this, is it? That tries to use very complex language
Yeah, it's interdimensional experiences and viewing. For me, it's interdimensional.
Well, yeah, Terry, and we've talked a number of times. We know each other from the conferences and so forth. And your experience is something that I've always, it's kind of a reference point in my mind, because you had a traumatic experience and it led you to develop these extraordinary abilities, right?
Yeah.
And Joe McMonagle's told us similar stories, and others, right? Other viewers, and it's just interesting to see this pattern, right? And the trauma is not something you'd voluntarily go through again, but there it happened, and it led to some amazing discovery within yourself. So it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yeah,
it really is. But this objective, and Sim, just because you're thinking about this so hard too, and talking about it, of getting people to get to this extraordinary good remote viewing place without trauma. I'm not sure Ingo had any major trauma in his
No, he
life.
didn't. He didn't.
Yeah, so he just worked. But I know, in fact, where John Knowles is going through the archive, and so is Deborah Katz, and it looks like he worked at it really hard.
Really hard.
Yeah,
really hard.
much harder than sort of I just basically assumed because I hadn't thought about it. And so there are other ways to get there. And I think that's
Marty,
important to share.
Let me add one more thing to this. I don't want to talk too much. I know I want to get going. But here's my dream about this. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not just the trauma that maybe someone experienced that led them to be a good RVer. It's the trauma they experienced later from society of demonstrating these skills and being ridiculed. Just like UFO witnesses. Again, I wrote this whole book about it just because of that feeling. Black Swan Ghost, my most recent book. Because when people experience something out of the ordinary in our society in the West, they're really ostracized and attacked, right?
Right.
And what I'd like to do, I guess my dream of all this is to say, wait a minute, we've got a very good scientifically defensible theory that says this is not super normal, it's just normal. In a multiverse, this is normal, okay? And that way people like Terry and others who've had experiences like this don't feel, I know Terry doesn't hide it, but people younger, let's say children, younger people, teenagers, when they have an ability like this, they feel comfortable coming forward to the rest of us and talking about it, right? And not feeling like they have to hide it away. Because, it shows you there's something amazing when you can get this precognitive experience like Terry's describing. She meets this person later on, the dentist, and everything he described. And you go, like, how is this possible? And it's an amazing experience that reaffirms to you that there's something amazing about the universe that's working in your favor, right? You're not just totally alone. And that's a positive thing to me. And that's what it all comes down.
And that's what we have to get in this new paradigm shift. I call it the consciousness paradigm shift. You're looking to a new way of looking at the universe, which is as different as all your early examples, Galileo, etc.
Just as different as from Galileo to what existed at the time. No different. It's exactly the same thing.
And we're both working for that. I happen to taking a strategy which says money talks to society. You're still working with science. And I was so happy to hear Pudov getting involved because, boy,
isn't that great?
That's so one. And they mentioned consciousness specifically in that write-up. Okay. Other questions for Sim? Comments? This is all cutting edge stuff. We are really right at the cutting edge of all of this, guys.
Yeah, because at least, Marty, we don't have to apologize anymore. When someone says there's no science to back up what you're talking about, you can pull up all these articles I just showed you in peer-reviewed journals.
Yep.
No, there's established physicists that say we're interacting with other worlds. Yeah. Okay, end of story. We don't know exactly how it comes out, but it's no longer extra scientific anymore.
Okay, look, you directed that at me, Sim, and let me tell you, I am so past that you have no idea.
Good.
Where at this point in time, most of my focus, and every now and then I come by people where this does become an issue, but I'm not out to convince anybody. I am out to make people better remote viewers, show they can apply it in a rather practical way, which is making money. So
right. Well, and I guess from my personal point of view, coming in contact with the scientific community, I've given presentations to different sociological, and that's the criticism you get. There's
I know
the Sean Carrolls of the world saying there's no science,
and that's why it's good. Right.
Well, not that might have been true a couple of years ago. It's not true anymore.
I know, and that's terrific. And
We've moved the
please,
ball down the field.
you got to
Yeah.
keep doing that. And I know a lot of others are doing that.
Yeah,
I
because
mean,
now we've
race
got data,
cars.
now we've got a theory, and okay. So anyway, it just changes the dialogue, and we don't have to be so defensive about it.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
I have another comment. It's amazing how many professionals are scared of
Yes.
remote viewing. They're terrified.
Terrified.
Yeah.
And our own government sponsored this, guys. I mean, this comes out of government program, and then they debunk their own program.
Can I give you my theory on why I think
Yeah, go ahead.
ultimately they're terrified?
Okay.
Because I live with my wife, who's now a believer, was totally a skeptic, but you can't hang around me enough and I show enough examples, and she believes in precognition and all this. But what she is terrified, and I think deep down this may be what everybody is terrified, is being able to get into your mind at will. That I would know, we talk about a world without secrets, but first we talk about it at the generic level. Imagine a government without secrets. Well, you can almost begin to imagine that would already be a paradigm shift if there would, if you could get into the quote government's mind. But now it gets down, do you want everybody to get into your mind? Do you want everybody to know what you're thinking? And I think that may very well be the biggest fear. And you go way back up, and a person's first gets involved in a remote viewing, and I think they sense that's how far it goes. That's my feeling of what the deepest fear is.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. May or may not be true, but I think there's something to that. Because we do all talk about a world without secrets, but what does that really mean?
Mm-hmm.
And my only comeback to that, frankly, is I think you probably can learn to protect your own mind and do blocks and stuff like that. The whole literature's on that as well already. But I don't know that.
After Lynn Buchanan's heart attack and surgery, he bilocated to me. He was right outside the big glass sliding doors.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's cool. And Lynn is one of the guys that says he got into other people's minds, did it on purpose. What about the remote influencing work? This is where fear comes from. And I almost hate to bring it up, but it's part of what we're touching. And this new paradigm, imagine a world where you feel comfortable with people being in your mind. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Sim and I, before we got on this, we talked about how what we're doing now is almost like mental telepathy. I mean, we're talking to each other and sharing what's in our mind right now, from all over the world.
Yeah.
And I'm not really hearing you, Marty, and you're not really hearing me, right?
Yeah.
We're hearing replications of our computers, right? A simulation.
Yep.
But very close.
Yeah.
I have often, I got to tell you, Marty, I have often thought, people have asked me what they thought would be the effect of these NSA supercomputers, like at the Utah data center and places where they gather like all the data from the world with these massively powerful computers. But what's going to happen at some point, right? Is when you increase the computing power, eventually you'll come up against a boundary of a new law in physics or another reality or the next parallel reality, right? And then you'd be starting all over from scratch. You'd just be a grain of sand again instead of this powerful thing.
No, yeah, but in some ways in the computer world, we're already there. Quantum
We're already there. Very close.
Quantum computers are what is now the new approach. And imagine what happens 15, 20, 100 years from now when quantum computers are fully developed. Now you're going to get to ask a really interesting question. Is a quantum computer conscious? I mean, there's so much looking to the future of where all of this stuff is leading. It's just incredible.
Well, I personally don't think the computers will ever be conscious.
Not linear ones. What about quantum
Not the way we are, because we have bodies and experiences and memories and things. But what you're saying is really true, because from that, the way quantum computers are described now, we keep the particle, the electron in superposition, so it could be both at the same time,
Right.
and we can compute that much faster. But from a many worlds point of view, the computer is now in two realities simultaneously, where the particle is spin up and down, and then in our reality we see one version, but the other one is also real. So any of these technologies, Marty, it doesn't necessarily have to be UFOs and Tom DeLonge and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've thought this for a while, is that we've often thought when the ETs come to us, if that were to happen, they would bring new technology, right? But it could emerge just out of the power of our own technology, leading us to realize that we live around parallel realities. I mean, quantum computing could be that sort of thing that shows us, Marty, almost like what it's like. We've been there the whole time, but didn't realize it,
Sure.
Like in Galileo's world. We were always going around the sun. We just didn't know it.
Right. And the eternal now brings that in with time too. I mean, it's all out there now. All of your universes.
Simultaneously, big now moment. Yep.
Yeah. There's so much. You obviously captured many of our interests, certainly mine.
Yeah, well, we're doing parallel paths here. We're all
we'll keep talking about this stuff, obviously, on and on.
Marty, if we can just show people this isn't para anything. I mean, maybe some people don't want to give up the idea of paranormal. This is science. It's not paranormal. It's physics that we're just getting to understand, just the way people thought vacuum spaces.
That's right.
Remember people like Torricelli that developed vacuums after one of Galileo's, I think, students?
Yep.
The Torricellian network. It took people to experiment, and they realized this is ordinary. It's not. There's nothing bad's going to happen by experimenting with vacuums, right?
Exactly.
It's superstition. It's just something we don't. And I feel like these phenomena, all of it, we didn't talk about Bigfoot and ghosts. Obviously, that's a little more speculative, but I'm confident those will all come into this paradigm too, just in another type of bleed through that we didn't.
Yeah.
The implication of this point of view is that there are things about our own world that we don't see because it hasn't really, turned over that way. The other realities bump into ours and show us those things. So
that's wonderful, Sim. That's really a great conclusion, if you will.
Yeah. Are there any more questions? I mean, does anyone find this? Did anyone find this? They didn't like it. They don't find it believable. I mean, I'm sure it's not appealing. I mean, anyone have a negative comment on any of this? That they like Copenhagen, they don't like many worlds. A lot of people don't like many worlds. I mean, there are people that find it kind of repulsive. It's threatening. The idea that the funny thing is, I was reading some of Galileo's original stuff, his text and his words. You know what he said in this amazing quote? And this is maybe a good way to end it. That the most important thing is imagination. To imagine other worlds before we see them. That's how you'll discover them. And isn't that what it's really all about, is to realize that your imagination is something real, and that everyone has been dealing with this for hundreds of years against the social limitations and boundaries that are imposed on us, right? And Galileo said, if you could imagine our universe perfectly, you'd realize it's infinite. And that's what scared people back then, Marty. You're saying mind, someone reading your mind or getting your mind. Back then, the scary idea was that it was infinite. People, that was just like, I just can't go there.
Send me that quote about imagination, because I use the one from Einstein. Einstein has a very similar one.
Galileo had his own quotes. He felt like he was the imagination master, and he was pushing society to expand their imaginations. Just imagine the idea that it's infinite or almost infinite. That's what he said he was doing. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing. It's the same nowadays. It's just the same thing.
It is.
And that's the best analogy. So thanks for bringing that up again. That's the really analogy, because you can realize people have been going through the same thing for hundreds of years, being scared by the fact that it's bigger than you thought it was.
That's right.
But it's probably really, really big. So just get over it. You'll be fine. Don't worry. You'll be fine.
Okay.
It was awesome. Thank you.
It was awesome. Sim, thanks a lot, and we'll obviously stay in touch. All of you, take care. This was great. Yeah, this was great.
Talk soon.
Right, you take care.
Okay, bye.
And I'll end this now.